as I have heard said. If men were angels, then no government would be necessary.
The Anarcho-Christian Podcast, evaluating the relationship between the Christian and the state.
Give us a king to rule us when you're gone. His life's work had been to help the people understand it's not the role of a man to rule over other men.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the show. So, there's this quote from James Madison that gets thrown around a lot in support of a state. Well, more so the need for a state. I see it mostly used by conservative Christians, but any brand of patriot or minarchist keeps it in his back pocket, especially for the Christian context of opposing a state. After all, it comes from a founding father. It uses the word angel and channels the doctrine of total depravity. So let's go over this objection today and see if we can answer it. Let's see if Madison's remark is consistent with this doctrine and if it's the slam dunk that conservatives think it is. You've probably heard it before. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. Boom. Mic drop. Move to Somalia, anarchist. Well, that's the way it's intended, but I believe that we will totally debunk this position today. Let's start with the background on this quote. Again, it is from James Madison. It comes from The Federalist, number 51. If you're not familiar, the Federalist Papers were a collection of essays written by
Alexander Hamilton,
James Madison, and John Jay, but all published under the pseudonym Publius. As Clinton Rossiter explains in the introduction to the Federalist Papers, the Federalist is the most important work in political science that has ever been written, or is likely ever to be written, in the United States. It is, indeed, the one product of the American mind that is rightly counted among the classics of political theory. This work has always commanded widespread respect as the first and still most authoritative commentary on the Constitution of the United States. As you may know, the Constitution of the United States was written between May 25th and September 17th of 1787. During what we call now the Constitutional Convention. It was eventually ratified July 21st, 1788. It replaced the previous Articles of Confederation between the 13 states that was ratified March 1st, 1781. In general, the Articles of Confederation are summed up as giving the states more sovereign power and independence, and established a much weaker central government than the Constitution that would replace it later that decade. As you can see, the Federalists argued for the Constitution and presented these 85 essays to the public between the Constitutional Convention and the Constitution's ratification. The opposition to the Federalists were known as the Anti-Federalists. You can find their arguments against the Constitution and the Federalist Papers in the Anti-Federalist Papers. They were also released publicly, and the most notable writer was Patrick Henry, who famously said, "Give me liberty or give me death," as the American Revolution was heating up. The other contributors were aliases and pseudonyms such as John DeWitt, Sentinel, Cato, and Brutus. I'd like to get further into the arguments between the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist, the Constitution, and the Articles of Confederation, but today we are just going to focus on Madison's words in Federalist number 51. So, Federalist number 51. is addressed to the people of New York and is titled, "The Structure of the Government Must Furnish the Proper Checks and Balances Between the Different Departments." In it, Madison explained checks and balances and separation of powers within a national government. In the third paragraph is where we find the often cited quote about angels, and it reads, "It is equally evident that the members of each department should be as little dependent as possible on those of the others for the emoluments annexed to their offices. Were the executive magistrate or the judges not independent of the legislature in this particular, their independence in every other would be merely nominal. But the great security against a gradual concentration of the several powers in the same department consists in giving to those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachments of the others. The provision for the defense must in this, as in all other cases, be made commensurate to the danger of attack. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interest of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government, which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. So the context of Madison's words are talking about the human nature within power, so we need to break up the power of people in the government within multiple departments. Which, in the context of government, maybe that's true, but you still need to convince me we need some sort of coercive governance at all. Which is what this quote is used for. So, besides correcting the context when someone uses it to advocate for the necessity of a coercive state government, how do we answer this statement when it is used like this?
Corruption would certainly prove irresistible.
Well, there you have it, as I have heard said. If men were angels, then no government would be necessary.
Well, sadly, that is very well said.
If men were angels, no government would be necessary. Regardless of the context for within government or the absence of government, the way this statement is used makes a few poor assumptions. First, the implications that all angels are good. Second, that government is necessary. And third, who makes up government? Men. Well, people. Regardless of gender, all men, all people are fallen. Which is what this quote is referencing when it says we are not angels. All right, before I get too far ahead of myself, let me answer each of those. The angel thing is a nice platitude, but the idea that angels are without the capability of being bad is actually poor theology that leads to poor assumptions, and then acceptance of statements like this one in question. We don't often think about that, but most of us know that angels have sinned. I know that the phrase angel is used quite a bit to just express how good someone is, how nice they are, or quiet or patient, things like that. But if we're going to make some sort of doctrine or argument for the necessity of government, I do think it's important to get into the Bible and really use these words accurately. Revelation 12 recounts the fall of Satan and his angels that were thrown down with him. And a couple other references to that are Jude 1:6, and the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. And 2 Peter 2:4 recounts God not sparing angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment. We could probably go on all day with angelology. And you may think I'm splitting hairs on this one, but I do think it might be important to point out to the Madison State apologist. Okay, on to my second point. Is government necessary? I know a lot of people argue over the word government. Is it synonymous with the state? If it isn't, can there be a government that is voluntary? I don't want to get into the argument today because I think Madison is using it synonymously with a state. And that's the way we are going to address this comment. Is the state necessary? Is coercive government necessary? Will it be Mad Max, everyone chaotically murdering each other without the stability of the state?
Introduce a little anarchy. Upset the established order, and everything becomes chaos.
One of the claims against anarchists and voluntarists is that they are just against government. However, we do have answers, not just complaints. So the implied question would be, how can social order be maintained without a state? The answers are pretty simple when we break out of the lazy indoctrination of the state. And I say lazy because it's a default that someone else will take care of it, so we don't have to, or because we are incapable. But that's not very American. We don't like the idea of being lazy, incapable, or incompetent. We pride ourselves in being able to defend our turf and family if needed. We pride ourselves in our business savvy and ingenuity. I think you get the point. There is a strong disconnect in our statist rhetoric and our independence rhetoric. All in all, if you're having this discussion with someone, you may have to break through this state versus individual rhetoric. Once you do, let's imagine how this individualistic gumption might play out. The term we are looking for that is antithetical to state-provided, subsidized, or nationalized services is privatized. As anarchists and voluntarists, we want everything privatized. That's not just goods and services, but also charity instead of state-subsidized welfare. And that's all services, too. Most conservatives are completely fine with this until we have to dig into the details. Of course, we don't want state-made cars and phones and goods like that, but we also don't want state-run grocery stores or home maintenance or automotive maintenance. Services like that. And there are some services people would be okay with turning over to a free or privatized market, like the Postal Service or even education. But what about services we've just come to accept as exclusively the role of the state, like police, or in some places fire protection, or the military? These can be summed up as defense, privatized defense. It's a good thought experiment to imagine how privatized defense would work. Competition helps drive down prices while driving up customer service, and that works in any industry. And there are two main points that need to be considered when thinking about privatized service versus the state. One, privatized and therefore voluntary is the moral option, because coercion is objectively immoral. And a state system that is funded exclusively through coercive taxation or looting through repressive fines for victimless crimes is immoral. And two, it's simply more efficient. It's no secret to see that private companies have to watch their bottom line, whereas a state organization just raises taxes or looks to increase fines for revenue generation. But when the private companies look to cut costs, they become more efficient. They look for a cheaper way to accomplish the goal. This is good for the customer, and again, any industry. I'll include links to Bob Murphy's Chaos Theory. You can buy printed copies or read it for free through the Mises Institute. It's one of my favorite resources for thinking through how things might run without the state, including defense. So that's privatizing everything. But the third poor assumption from this phrase should lead us to ask, who is government made of? It's made up of the same non-angels that are needed to protect non-angels from other non-angels. This is the most ironic point of all, and like I said, gets us into some doctrinal stuff. The point here is that men are not perfect, and more so, they are out to steal and take advantage for their own personal gain. The mistake is that coercive government will somehow curb that, when it's the same sinful, self-interested people that are running for government. So a Christian may look at this in one of two ways. One, the phrase is misguided because men are inherently good. Or two, the phrase is speaking to man being inherently bad. I'm not going to tell anyone what they need to think, just how we can approach this categorically. Now, someone that might believe point one, that is, everyone is inherently good, won't be using Madison's quote to call for state control. So, someone that is calling for state control will have to agree with point two if pressed. Someone might try to go back and forth on some people are bad and some people are good, but generally in a theological discussion concerning the Christian Bible, we are talking objectively for all people. All people are made by God equally and have or have not fallen into sin as a whole. In my experience, anything outside of this discussion of all humanity being equally fallen or not fallen is generally a cult, or some minority opinion that usually gets into some terrible collectivizing over particular groups of people, labeling some as inherently bad while others are inherently good. But anyways, point two essentially is the Christian doctrine of total depravity. Again, I'm not going to try to convince anyone of this doctrine, just approach this as if the person you are talking to affirms it. This is something that you can do with a proper understanding of any doctrine, without having to even affirm it yourself. I have had numerous discussions with people of other faiths simply discussing where we differ. And I can tell you, not only were we able to still be friendly with each other, but I was still able to get in the gospel message. And I like to think that those individuals didn't mind hearing it and considering it because of the nature of our discussion. In life, I've definitely failed more times than succeeded in that, but I'm just saying it is possible, and it's something I strive to do every time. So let's look at total depravity. What does it actually mean? Because I used to have a pretty skewed perception of it before I started really looking into it. It appears that the phrase total depravity was first used by Cleland McAfee while lecturing in Presbyterian Union of Newark around 1905. Unfortunately, there isn't a copy of the lecture to be found, but the first known printed use is from a Presbyterian newspaper in 1913. But of course, the doctrine itself did not originate in the early 1900s. The doctrine of total depravity is mostly associated with John Calvin, whose major work is the Institutes of the Christian Religion, which was first published in 1536. And it can also be associated with other reformers like Martin Luther and his 1525 publication On the Bondage of the Will. Reformed doctrine that includes total depravity was mostly first summed up during the Synod of Dort between 1618 and 1619. But reformers such as Calvin like to back up their position of man's fallen nature all the way back to St. Augustine. So what is total depravity, and what does it mean? And because of the primarily Calvinistic association, I think I'm going to get our definition and clarification of total depravity from R.C. Sproul. He is a highly regarded Reformed theologian, and I think he delivers a well-worded explanation that even if you do not generally agree with him or the doctrine, we will have a thorough understanding of what is meant by total depravity. The following is from Sproul's article series Tulip and Reformed Theology. The doctrine of total depravity reflects the Reformed viewpoint of original sin. That term, original sin, is often misunderstood in the popular arena. Some people assume that the term original sin must refer to the first sin, the original transgression that we've all copied in many different ways in our own lives. That is, the first sin of Adam and Eve. But that's not what original sin has referred to historically in the church. Rather, the doctrine of original sin defines the consequences of the human race because of that first sin. Virtually every church historically that has a creed or a confession has agreed that something very serious happened to the human race as a result of the first sin. That first sin resulted in original sin. That is, as a result of the sin of Adam and Eve, the entire human race fell, and our nature as human beings since the fall has been influenced by the power of evil. As David declared in the Old Testament, "O God, I was born in sin, and in sin did my mother conceive me." Psalm 51:5. He was not saying that it was sinful for his mother to have born children. Neither was he saying that he had done something evil by being born. Rather, he was acknowledging the human condition of fallenness, that condition that was part of the experience of his parents, a condition that he himself brought into the world. Therefore, original sin has to do with the fallen nature of mankind. The idea is that we are not sinners because we sin, but that we sin because we are sinners. In the Reformed tradition, total depravity does not mean utter depravity. We often use the term total as a synonym for utter or for completely. But the notion of total depravity conjures up the idea that every human being is as bad as that person could possibly be. You might think of an arch-fiend of history, such as Adolf Hitler, and say there was absolutely no redeeming virtue in that man. But I suspect that he had some affection for his mother. As wicked as Hitler was, we can still conceive of ways in which he could have been even more wicked than he actually was. So the idea of total and total depravity doesn't mean that all human beings are as wicked as they can possibly be. It means that the fall was so serious that it affects the whole person. The fallenness that captures and grips our human nature affects our bodies. That's why we will become ill and die. It affects our minds and our thinking. We still have the capacity to think, but the Bible says the mind has become darkened and weakened. The will of man is no longer in its pristine state of moral power. The will, according to the New Testament, is now in bondage. We are enslaved to the evil impulses and desires of our hearts, the body, the mind, the will, the spirit. Indeed, the whole person have been infected by the power of sin. I like to replace the term total depravity with my favorite designation, which is radical corruption. Ironically, the word radical has its roots in the Latin word for root, which is radix. And it can be translated root or core. The term radical has to do with something that permeates to the core of a thing. It's not something that is tangential or superficial, lying on the surface. The Reformed view is that the effects of the fall extend or penetrate to the core of our being. Even the English word core actually comes from the Latin word cor, which means heart. That is, our sin is something that comes from our hearts. In biblical terms, that means it's from the core or very center of our existence. So what is required for us to be conformed to the image of Christ is not simply some small adjustments or behavioral modifications, but nothing less than renovation from the inside. We need to be regenerated, to be made over again, to be quickened by the power of the Spirit. The only way in which a person can escape this radical situation is by the Holy Spirit's changing the core, the heart. However, even that change does not instantly vanquish sin. The complete elimination of sin awaits our glorification in heaven. So there's the doctrine of total depravity. I think you can see why I felt that we needed to review that doctrine in context of answering our original Madison text. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. But what is government made of? Non-angelic or sinful men. This sinful nature or inclination in man, that apparently must be governed, doesn't go away when someone is elected into a public office. And it doesn't go away when you have multiple offices checking on each other. There will, of course, be altruistic rhetoric in the campaigns and throughout terms, but we all know, even outside of the lesser of two evil dualistic arguing, that politicians are, well, politicians. All of those accusations of being two-faced, greedy, etc., still apply, regardless of party. Self-centered motivations do not go away when someone is elected to public offices. As I often quote, I think Lord Acton and Frank Herbert were both right, even though Frank Herbert presented his position in contrast to Acton's. Acton said, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." And Herbert said, "It is not that power corrupts, but that it is magnetic to the corruptible." To sum it all up, the irony here, the reason why his statement doesn't have the authoritative power people think it does, is because when you think about it, it says, men are depraved, so we need depraved men to rule over depraved men. When we say it like that, it doesn't sound as noble as Madison's words, but this is a big inconsistency to the logic. But what do you think? Have you encountered this argument as a need for the state or government? Were you already familiar with the doctrine of total depravity? I will have links to the article I mentioned, as well as our Amazon affiliate links for the books. If you use that link to get the books or do any of your Amazon shopping, Anarcho-Christian will get a small commission at no additional charge to you. Don't forget to subscribe to the Anarcho-Christian podcast on whatever podcatcher you're using. If you're not sure where to find us, visit anarchochristian.com/subscribe. There you'll find links to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Android, Google Play, and YouTube. If you're enjoying the podcast, please consider letting us know by leaving a 5-star rating and review on iTunes, or wherever you catch the episodes. Also, like and share the episodes on Facebook or the other social media sites. You can support the show with a monthly donation through Patreon or Subscribestar, or a one-time donation through PayPal. You can visit us on those sites, or you can visit the Support the Show tab on anarchochristian.com. That will take you to a page where you'll find the links to Patreon, Subscribestar, and PayPal. So I think that's it for today. Grace and peace. No king but Christ.
He cried out to God, won't you help them to believe? This power is illusion, the need to rule is greed. Your love and your light is really all they need. It's really all we need.
Thank you for listening to the Anarcho-Christian Podcast. Subscribe to our email notifications at anarchochristian.com, like us on facebook.com/anarchochristian, and follow us on Twitter at anarchoxp. Subscribe to our podcast and YouTube to join us next time as we continue to evaluate the relationship between the Christian and the state. No king but Christ.
There's a season for every single thing. The people...
Introduce a little anarchy. Upset the established order, and everything becomes chaos.
Well, there you have it, as I have heard said. If men were angels, then no government would be necessary.
Well, sadly, that is very well said.